I would now like to introduce the speakers. Mike Duniway is a soil scientist and ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, Southwest Biological Science Center. His focus is on dryland ecosystems and the interactions between environment and land use drivers, vegetation, and soils. Much of Mike's research is centered on the role soils and geomorphology play in mediating ecosystem processes, and most importantly, the implications of soil-induced landscape heterogeneity for land management. Travis Nauman is a soil scientist, also at the USGS, Southwest Biological Science Center. His focus is on how soils mediate ecosystem responses to drivers of change. Travis works primarily on ways to integrate emerging geospatial technologies in efforts to help contextualize field studies and develop new soil survey products to support applied research and modeling. Welcome, Mike and Travis.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone, for attending. This is Mike speaking. Hopefully you can all see the slides. I'm going to start the webinar and give a little background information on some of the work we're doing and provide some context, and then Travis is going to jump in at get the majority of the presentation talking about our new tools and how we're applying them for assessing oil and gas impacts. So most of this talk is going to be about oil and gas and the impacts of oil and gas development on the Colorado Plateau. This is probably not new information for most of you on the phone, but oil and gas development has been increasing rapidly, particularly since the new fracking technologies emerged. So this is some data showing here of just oil and gas development wells by year, so the number of wells in Utah, just using one of the state databases. And you can see between sort of 2000 and the peak in 2008, we had a tripling in the rate of oil and gas development in Utah. And this sort of trend was going on across the Colorado Plateau. I think our internet here is pretty slow, so I'm going to see. So this is an aerial image showing an oil and gas play up in the vernal area. So each one of these little things here are an oil pad development, and then just to fast forward to 2013, I can see we have two computers here, so I can see Travis's and I can see his hasn't moved forward yet, so I'm going to wait for it. There it is. You can see how much the oil and gas development has intensified just over those 6 or 7 years. And there's no reason to expect that, you know, the development, the drop in development we've seen recently is going to persist. You know, there's lots of oil and gas reserves on the plateau that'll get played out or get developed soon. There it is. So this map here is showing future oil and gas and other mineral reserves identified by the USGS Energy Resources Program, and this figure is from a paper Stella Copeland and others have in review, where the different colors represent different types of reserves, and the stronger the color, the more certain they are in the reserve. And just to call out one here, so this dark green swath here that's oil, and that is right underneath sort of Canyonlands National Park, and then heading south of Moab and into southwestern Colorado. So we have seen, if you remember that very first graph I showed you, we've seen a drop in drilling recently, but we could expect it to ramp back up at some point in the future. So this is an important sort of land management concern on the Colorado Plateau and in many ecosystems of the southwestern U.S. And this development does have impact on the ecosystem and the ecosystem services they provide. I'm stalling, so I'm waiting for the next slide to come up.
Hey, Mike, this is Mary. Your slides are coming in fine on.
Okay, good. Maybe it's just Travis's because he's on the same network. Maybe his is really slow. Okay, well, that's good. Thanks for letting me know, Mary. Brady Allred and others did some great work looking at the impacts of oil and gas development in the central U.S., including Utah, New Mexico, all the way up into Canada, showing that just the energy boom we've had in the last 15 years has greatly reduced primary productivity, and as well as forage production in that grassland ecosystem. Here on the Colorado Plateau, visual resources are of paramount concern. We have a lot of national parks and other recreation economy sort of attractions, and so aesthetics and just the visual impact of having these developments is an issue for many. We recently went through what was called a master leasing plan here for the Moab region, and there was a lot of contention between the local sort of outdoor outfitter types and energy production types, and that mostly a lot of that was centered around sort of the visual resources. Road development and other kind of disturbances can be a conduit for invasives. There's some work done by Gelbard and others in 2003 on the Colorado Plateau showed that some cheatgrass is being distributed along road networks. Any kind of disruption to the surface topography can affect surface hydrology and erosion processes, causing diversion of water, concentration of water, accelerated erosion. This map here is a high-resolution DEM showing how this subtle road blade is altering sort of the hydrology of this gradual hill slope in southern New Mexico. The blue lines here are sort of modeled water flow paths. And then a big issue here in the Colorado Plateau is dust. The potential contribution of dust from energy development to regional haze and dust issues. So as I mentioned earlier, the recreation and associated tourist economy is a big deal. Our view sheds are very important. This is a picture we have from what we call our dust cam. We have a couple dust cams around the region. This one's by the Needles District in Canyonlands National Park. This is on a beautiful, clear day. And this is what the view looks like on one of our bad air quality days, and the haze is due to primarily particulate matter in the form of dust. And that dust also has consequences beyond just our local area. Dust off the Colorado Plateau and the dry deserts of the Colorado Plateau lands on the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado, which has that coloring of the soil surface, the snow surface changes the albedo. Tom Painter and others did some great work looking at the effect of the changing albedo of the snowpack on the Rockies on the runoff of the Colorado River. So that darkening of the snowpack in 2009 caused the peak runoff from the Colorado River to be 3 weeks earlier, and perhaps more importantly, had a 5% less annual runoff. And so for those of you familiar with Colorado River water politics, this is 5% might not sound like a lot to many, but it's actually a big number. So 5% of the Colorado River annual runoff is twice of Las Vegas's allocation, 18 months of LA's use, and half of the Mexico's allocation. So dust is a big deal locally and potentially regionally. So getting back, thinking about the land use impacts of oil and gas development on desert ecosystems in the Colorado Plateau in particular, the effect of the road development or the pad development and how long that impact of the development will persist is going to be mediated by soil and geomorphic settings. So this sort of phenomenon is well understood, and particularly thinking about grazing management and other kinds of disturbance, that you're going to get a heterogeneous response to your disturbance activity based on sort of your soil and landscape properties. And so the types of things we think about when we think about landscape heterogeneity and how it might impact recovery or resilience to a disturbance, I think about sort of landscape properties that affect runoff and run-on. So are you in a place that's shedding water, perhaps accumulating water? Geologic mineralogy and the paramaterial can affect sort of nutrients, can affect soil texture, which affects water dynamics. Surface texture and surface properties are very important for mediating infiltration and mediating bare soil evaporation. And aspect is some photos showing southern aspects tend to be drier and warmer than northern aspects, which affects sort of ecosystem water balance and plant water availability. And of course, regional climate, so your elevation, where you are in the monsoon gradient, other aspects might affect your the resilience of your site. And then finally, for us in soil science, our favorite topic, thinking about soil profile development. So if you have a soil that has some sort of finer surface soils, or maybe a fine a soil horizon has a finer texture, your water infiltration might not go as deep and reside as long, or as opposed to like a coarser soil where the water is going deeper. So these sort of dynamics will sort of affect when and where water is available in the profile for plants. And then, of course, climate change is an issue for almost anything we could talk about these days in terms of land management and ecology. The Southwest climate forecasts are not good for us. They're predicting it to get warmer and drier, and probably with a greater probability of extended drought. So these kind of conditions will make recovery of disturbance like oil and gas development or other landscape disturbances more difficult. It will make restoration more challenging. So in response to some of these concerns, USGS has a new research program that we're part of. It's called it's funded by the Priority Ecosystem Sciences. We have coined it the Southwest Energy Development and Drought Project. So this is a multi-center USGS project where we're aiming to help understand some of the controls and consequences of energy development and drought on the Southwest. We're in our second year now, focusing on the Colorado Plateau. And this is a multi-investigator, multi-stage program, thinking about both social system and ecological systems, rehabilitation, and trying to sort of integrate all that information together. Today, we are just going to talk about this first part here. I'm going to turn it over to Travis here in just a minute, where we're thinking about trying to get a broad scale analysis of some of the ecological impacts of oil and gas development at the regional scale. All right, so with that, I'm going to get up and move, and Travis is going to take over.
Thanks, Mike. So this first chunk of work that we got into with this project was trying to get our minds around what impacts oil and gas development have had on the plateau. And it's a pretty grand challenge. We have 90,000 records of various oil and gas types of development. And so we needed a way to try and get a grand overview. And so the end from the beginning, if we look on the right, we wanted to figure out a way to select areas that we can compare with each pad as a type of reference to figure out, to be able to do a comparison to say, okay, this is how far this pad is from recovering, and then be able to do that across, this kind of vast number of records that we have on the plateau. And so in order to kind of tackle this challenge, we're looking at ways to identify reference areas, so kind of that conceptual map that I showed you at the beginning there. And when I say reference, a lot of you in the ecology realm might think of some kind of climax community, but really we're kind of keeping it simple, just something that has, when I say reference, just something that has the same ecological potential and the same history. So the only, when we're comparing a pad to a reference area, the only thing we want to be different between those two is the actual disturbance of focus, which is the oil and gas well pad disturbance. So we're trying to isolate that. And so, to kind of do that, we need to find areas that have this similar ecological potential, which Mike already kind of touched on a little bit in the history. And so, what do I mean when I say ecological potential? So kind of in a nutshell, a site that generally has the same species composition and structure, mainly for vegetation, but also thinking about, that'll support a certain community as far as wildlife goes. Then also the behavior of that site. What is its resistance to disturbance and to pressure? What is its resilience in coming back from a disturbance? And so kind of from my background, I think of it in kind of a factorial sense, which kind of comes out of classic soil science, where we have a set of factors or drivers. We have climate and organisms that are interacting with the topography and a parent material substrate, and those kind of all manifest over time into the soil and cover and ecological dynamics we see on site. And so if we have all these factors kind of similar over time, then we should have a similar ecological potential. So that's kind of the conceptual framework that we're working from. So kind of to delve into some of the details of that, first thing we're kind of starting with is soils. And so I'd like to touch on this a little bit. The main factors that we're kind of looking at and trying to constrain are depth, texture, and chemistry of our soils. And so on the Colorado Plateau, these are all pretty tightly tied to geology because it's a pretty young landscape. And so what you see on this slide are three kind of examples of soil variation. These are all soils from the plateau. So we have a deep sandy loam, pretty productive soil. Then we move over to the right here and we have moderately deep soil with more rocks, so maybe a little less productive. And then we go to this far right end and it's a shallow soil with strong calcic horizons. So we have a different texture, we have a different depth, we have a different chemistry. So all these are probably going to be, factors that would constrain and cause a different ecological potential at these sites. So thinking about another factor that's a big driver on the plateau, topography. So when you have different exposure to the elements, different aspect, different runoff patterns depending on where you are in the landscape, these all kind of manifest in different microclimates, different water availabilities. And so you can kind of get a little glimpse of that in the view from the LaSalle's near Moab here. So probably the trickiest part is how do we constrain the history of the site? Because when we're trying to go through thousands of records, we can't always dig up history for the site. And so we kind of double down on the first rule of geography, where near things are more related than distant things. And so we constrained our search for ecological reference to our well pads to a radial 2-kilometer radius. Just as kind of a simplest form, we make some assumptions that everything in the history is probably relatively similar within this neighborhood. But, if you, in other applications where you might have more specific information about an area, maybe you constrain it to a grazing allotment or a management unit or an ecological classification. So there are different ways that this can be implemented. The other thing we run up against when we're trying to go through this process to find appropriate comparisons is that we need a good soil map. And right now, in the U.S., we have some gaps in our field scale soil survey geographic database, or SURGO as most people refer to soil survey in the U.S. And so what we see here is all these red areas are areas where SURGO isn't completed. And so, we're talking about multiple billions of acres where we still don't quite have the information we need to do this. Another thing when it comes to soil survey is that generally soil survey map units always include multiple soils. Even if it's a single soil map unit, single name soil, you're always going to have some inclusions. But particularly in the West and in remote areas, which is generally where we're looking at for this stuff, they're going to be relatively coarse map units that have multiple soils in them. And so this is an example of some work where we tried to parse out map units, the variability within map units that I did in the past. And you can see this big map unit, the PLF, or Pineville-Gilpin-Guyandotte Association, has multiple soils within it. And we look at kind of these different colors within the map unit. And all three of these soils have very different management implications. Guyandotte's a wet, hollow soil with a lot of organic matter, and it's really rocky. Gilpin is a dry, moderately deep soil with pretty low productivity, and Pineville is kind of halfway in the middle between the two. So within this one soil map unit, we have a wide variety of soils that have kind of contrasting management implications. So what do we do with these soil dilemmas? Our solution was to turn to kind of an emerging body of research called digital soil mapping, where we utilize, so over here on the left, we utilize kind of the large amount of new spatial data sources that are available, satellite imagery, digital elevation models, and all the metrics you can calculate from those. And those are continuous maps. And so we relate those to field soil observations, and then we create a model based using, in this case, machine learning, a random forest, that helps us understand how the variation we see in our field observations of soils relate to these covariates. And usually we can get a pretty good model out of these. And so then we go over here to the right, and then once we understand the relationship, we use those covariate raster layers to predict a new soil map. And so that's what this looked like on the Colorado Plateau for us. We utilized a pretty large database that the Natural Resources Conservation Service houses, their National Soil Information System, which in the U.S. they have about 350,000 or so georeferenced observations of soil. But the tricky part about this database is that it's mostly soil taxonomic information that's attributed in it. Don't have like full soil profile descriptions for all of them. They're, transects that were done, quickly in the field. And so what we did was look through, kind of parse apart U.S. soil taxonomy to figure out what we thought, which theme would match best with our concepts of ecological potential. And as it turns out, at the family level of soil taxonomy, we have this class called soil particle size in the control section, which gives a good general description of soil texture and soil depth to a certain extent, and a little bit of soil mineralogy. And so you can see some of the class names here. We have clay, clay skeletal, fine, fine loamy. And so the advantage of mapping that theme is we have a ton of observations where we have those attributed, and we were able to actually get a pretty good accurate map out of it. So out of bag accuracy of 62%, which is pretty good in the soil mapping realm. We did some independent validation in the Canyonlands area where, given we have a lot more soil data, and we had a lot higher accuracy there. But the other interesting thing is, we've got a lot of experience here, people who have, mapped here. I've done some mapping here, and we have other folks that have done mapping on the Colorado Plateau. And the map really passes a sniff test. You can see these yellow areas are all kind of sandy areas where we have sandstones coming out in the geologic strata. And then the blue areas are kind of more shallow escarpment type stuff. And then we see these kind of more brown and orange areas are finer soils. And particularly up here, if we look in the Grand Valley, and those of you who know the geography around here know that the Manco shale comes out there, and we get a lot more finer textured soils. And those just pop out really, really nicely up here. And so we were really happy with this map. And so then we decided to integrate this map and then all these kind of concepts of ecological potential that I've been talking about into this process that we're calling the Automated Reference Tool Set, or ART. You always got to have a good acronym. And so essentially what we do is, so we might have a location, in this case it's a well pad of interest at the center of our neighborhood here, this neighborhood analysis, and we take our soil texture map, and we look at the value for that, and we take our topography layers that we have available. We do an unsupervised classification, so it gives us some classes for that, and then we also, for the Colorado Plateau, thought it would be handy to look at some Landsat geology ratios to try and parse apart geologic source material. And so what we did is say, okay, if other pixels in the neighborhood match the same class in all these three classifications, then we're going to highlight those as potential reference pixels. And you can see an example of that over here on the right. And we also make sure we screen out roads, agriculture, and developed areas from this analysis so that we're not getting those signals mixed up in it. And so we came up with this process, and so we needed a way to validate it to figure out if indeed it's giving us, matching ecological potential. And so we luckily have a lot of data sets around here, and in particular we have this data set that's collected that was collected near the Canyonlands Research Center, which is near Canyonlands National Park, where we have really well-documented ecological sites at these plots. And ecological sites are basically an ecological potential-based land classification system that's used in soil surveying by the NRCS and different land management agencies for conservation planning, and so they're a good surrogate for trying to figure out ecological potential. And so what we did is we ran ART, and we looked at each of these plots, and then looked at other neighboring plots that fell in their neighborhood, and looked at the pixels that we selected, and if the neighborhood plots fell into one of those pixels, we would expect it to have the same ecological site. And so we went through and cataloged all that when we ran ART on these plots, and we looked at correct matches and false matches. So, when we select a plot with our pixels, is it matching ecological site or not? And so that was the primary thing we looked at in this validation. So it's essentially a user accuracy. We also looked at some other scenarios in running the simulation where we correctly exclude a plot, so we didn't select it in the neighborhood if it wasn't the same ecological site, or omission error, which is, there was another plot in the neighborhood with the same ecological site, but we didn't select it with the ART process. And we mainly looked at maximizing this user accuracy, the correct matches divided by the total number of matches. And we got a pretty high agreement, so 67%, which is pretty good in ecological terms. And so we came to the conclusion, all right, we're doing pretty good at selecting areas of similar ecological potential with this methodology. So now back to the challenge. We've got all these sites. Now we know how to, in an automated fashion, select areas that are relatively equivalent in ecological potential, but how do we compare them? And so that's where we expanded the automated reference toolset into the disturbance automated reference toolset, or DART. And so with that, there's a couple of variations that we added in. First, we were screening roads before, but now we also got to make sure we screen out other oil and gas pads because they tend to be clustered. And so, we screen those out from kind of all these analysis. We don't want to use them in the classification. We don't want to use them in the matching. And so we go back to this map, which you guys have seen a couple times here, where we have this focal pad in the center and then these darkened pixels that we've selected as reference. And then the other big thing that we add in DART is a vegetation index. And so we, kind of in collaboration with Miguel Villarreal and Travis Poitras and their group in Menlo, we decided to use the soil-adjusted total vegetation index, which is proved to be a pretty high performer in arid and semi-arid landscapes because it gets at senescent vegetation better. And so we queried that out of Google Earth Engine, and then we extract values of StatV at our well pad, and then at all of our reference pixels, and then we compare. And so we create a distribution of these StatV values for our reference pixels, and generally we're picking out, a couple hundred pixels in this, and then we compare the value at our well pad to that distribution. In this case, we can see in the map the well pad's pretty bare, and we end up, coming up with a 0th percentile, meaning that it's, probably got less vegetation than almost everything around it, which makes sense. And so this percentile or quantile ended up being our chosen metric for trying to represent recovery at these sites. And so this is kind of what that looks like on the ground. This is a couple oil and gas pads that we visited last year. And so you can see this one at the top was a well pad plugged in 2010. And you can see there's a good bit of air ground and some kind of annuals that came in that will probably blow away. It still has a ways to go when you compare it to a nearby reference area that we identified in the field. And the quantile for this one is 0.14, which means that 84% of the areas that we identified as reference around it with DART had a higher StatV value. That's kind of what the quantiles are, essentially a fraction. So like, where are you in that distribution? So another example of a well pad plugged in 1976, and you'll notice here, as opposed to the 2010 one, where they actually did some swale work and tried to return it to a similar contour as the original one, as the original site. You can still see the original scarp from when they leveled the pad. And this one, we have a little higher quantile, and it kind of makes sense, because we've got more colonization. We got some 4-wing salt brush and snakeweed, which, you know, is what it is, and, you know, you got some globe mallow and some grasses coming in, and we compare it to that. It's still got a little ways to go before it's, you know, really going to be looking like the reference site, but it's, you know, hopefully it's on the path. So just as kind of, you know, what this looks like in the field. So also, you know, we needed to know a little bit more about the performance of DART and using the SAT-V quantiles. And so we were working with the BLM Assessment Inventory and Monitoring Program, and we looked through their plots to find stuff that was clustered enough that we could simulate DART. And what we found was that the DART quantiles correlated well with foliar cover and exposed bare ground. So essentially, if the plot in the center that we were looking at had less foliar cover than the reference areas, then you'd have a higher relative difference. We're using a relative difference metric on the y-axis here. And so we got these pretty decent relationships. They're kind of noisy because we're trying to represent a couple hundred reference pixels with 2 to 5 plots. We're still able to pick out the trends we were expecting. We also had a little field data set where we went out and did some ocular, just basal bare ground estimates at oil and gas pads and then comparable reference areas. And a couple of those were in those photos I just showed and had kind of a similar result. So we're relatively confident, especially with lower quantiles, that we're picking out sites that are not doing so well. And so it gives us a good kind of first cut, you know, assessment that we can automate to monitor oil and gas pad recovery. And so this is what that looks like, and this is part of some analysis that we just submitted in a paper for in Science of the Total Environment. And so we can see in this map the red well pads being stuff that have lower quantiles or poor recovery, yellow being kind of moderate, and green being good. And so this kind of gives us a little visual of what's going on. And this is a subset of the oil and gas pads on the plateau that we could validate had indeed been developed into full, you know, into fully operational wells and then plugged and abandoned. And Miguel and our Menlo cooperators went through and did an awesome job vetting all these sites, making sure that when they checked those, you know, the plug dates, that there indeed was a pad there when, you know, before it got plugged, and so that we're you know, actually looking at well pad recovery. And so this was a data set from 1997 to 2005, so about, you know, 1,800 pads. And so we see kind of up in this upper left corner of the distribution, we see a real right skew distribution in these quantiles, meaning that most of the pads that we analyzed have a pretty low quantile or kind of a lower recovery status if we trust DART. So it means that, you know, in the amount of time they've had to recover, they haven't really made a whole lot of progress. So that in of itself is, you know, an interesting result. And then we wanted to look at patterns in this recovery that we saw in the quantile values kind of across these broad environmental gradients that we have on the plateau. And so we did a series of different analyses, and this is kind of a summary of the stuff that stuck out to us. We did some machine learning stuff, trying to parse out which variables out of the ones we hypothesized might have influence would be affecting recovery. We did some bivariate stuff. We did some visualization. And so the main results we came up with is that we had poorer recovery associated with a higher ratio of summer to annual precipitation, so a stronger monsoonal signal in our you know, seasonal precipitation distribution. So we can see that graph up here in the upper right, where once you get up to about 40% of your precipitation coming in the summer, things kind of start dropping off as far as recovery. And another interesting result we had was that state-administered wells tend to be doing worse, and it's a pretty valid comparison because state is generally checkerboarded with federal, and so similar distribution among environmental gradients. So that's an interesting one. We also found that some ecological types, as characterized by the USGS Southwest REGAP map, were doing worse, in particular grasslands, like shale badlands, black brush systems, canyon complexes. And another kind of tidbit that came out, not shown in the data here on the slide, but that when you have more exposed convex landform, it would shed water, so probably drier, more susceptible to losing water quickly. We're also doing worse. So relatively intuitive, but some interesting results for sure. So just to kind of recap, ART and DART, really the new 30-meter soil map of the Colorado Plateau we made was key in all this analysis. When you take that out, we can't really do the matching. And so the neighborhood analysis of topography and geology kind of helps us, gives us specificity, and we discussed this in the paper that they don't really help the user accuracy that much. And in particular, we probably don't need the geology ratios, and which is a good result when we go outside of the Colorado Plateau, because once you get into forested systems, it's going to be a different ballgame. But and then in our reference pixel selection, we're generally picking same ecological site, which is good. It's what we want. The soil-adjusted total vegetation index worked well as a way to compare our paths to our reference areas that we select, and we're getting good inference on vegetation cover differences, and bare ground is the primary variable in whether we're going to be losing soil when we have these wind events. So going back to thinking about dust emissions and visibility, and these detected patterns that we saw in the recovery can have implications for management. We can start thinking about sites that are more resilient to these disturbances, and we're thinking about leasing process and that kind of thing. So we're pretty excited about this first cut of these tools to assess things, and we're thinking about expanding them, and we're already working with some folks to expand that particle size and control section map. We're working with Tommy Hingle at soilgrids.org and ISRIC. They're a group out of the Netherlands who've been working a lot on global digital soil mapping. So we've got a nice draft map at 100-meter resolution, so we're trying to kind of digest that and see how that works as far as resolution and scale for taking this outside of the Colorado Plateau. And so in the future, we'll probably, it's probably not too far out before these tools will be available for the lower 48. Still got to do a little bit of formatting of some of the topography variables and whatnot. But and also we'll probably, one of our goals in the next year is to set up a web tool so that people can interact with this stuff in the web. Some future applications that we'll probably be doing soon, looking at boundary monitoring. So if we want to compare something like International Park to a neighboring allotment, we can do this automated DART type of monitoring, or use it to allocate field plots to have valid comparisons. We're going to do some analysis of regional grazing exposures and look at those probably over time, and kind of what we already went over is discrete disturbances. So oil and gas pads are one example, but any discrete disturbance you have would be an application that you could use DART or ART for. Turn it over to Mike here.
All right, thanks, Travis. Just a couple closing comments here, and then we'll open it up for questions. So for next steps for our Southwest project, we really want to begin we're going to be doing some field investigations this year to understand some of those patterns that Travis was describing that from the DART. So thinking about the role native, non-native, invasive, annual species that might be playing in some of the patterns we saw, or controls of reduced soil quality and compaction that might be limiting recovery. We're very interested, as Travis mentioned, in doing some temporal applications. What you saw here was just doing a 1 year, looking at Landsat from 1 year, and it may be great to look at some of these different kinds of settings and disturbances over time to see how they're responding to sort of decade-old climate patterns. Dust is a big issue. What we have here is just really looking at SATD, which is correlated with bare ground and foliar cover. Thinking about some of our management concerns, the concern of managers here regionally, we would like to be able to apply those sort of SATD values to dust and to get an idea of how maybe dust signals from oil pads is reducing or not through time. other applications of art outside of our immediate sort of research, we'll be thinking about maybe post-fire assessments and monitoring, particularly thinking about some of the issues they're having in the Great Basin with sage grouse. Wildlife habitat restoration monitoring. We spend a lot of money on wildlife habitat restoration, and so this would maybe give a way to be able to do broad-scale analysis of how those are working or not. And, you know, what Travis showed us here was sort of really broad-scale evaluation of oil and gas impacts, and we could imagine how this could also be used for sort of more local-scale monitoring. I mean, especially in field offices or districts where they have lots of oil and gas development. You could think about this sort of remote sensing DART application as a first cut that might trigger field monitoring that could be then followed up with maybe reclamation or other activities. Finally, as Travis was talking about, we're really interested in sort of developing this tool set so it can be applied to other ecoregions in the U.S. and also to make web applications so people who don't have sort of the skills that Travis was demonstrating could be able to develop some of their reference points for use in their for other applications. And I think with that, we'd like to say thank you and open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Mike and Travis. So audience, you have two options for asking questions. You're welcome to unmute your phone and speak your question. To do that, all you have to do is press *6 to unmute yourself, and then to mute yourself when you're done, you can just press *6 again. And then, of course, the usual way, which is typing in questions into that chat box, sending them to the host, who's me, and I'll read them to Mike and Travis. So we'll take a few seconds here to see if any questions show up in the queue. And if anybody has a question by phone, feel free to unmute yourself pressing *6.
This is Bruce Rittenhouse with the BLM here in the Colorado State Office, and I don't know if this is for you, Travis, or Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so good. I was wondering about how one thing you didn't mention here was about mitigation, which I think was interesting because the new mitigation standards are talking about ensuring that you have to do mitigation, and your mitigation has to occur until you get back to kind of standard conditions and baseline conditions again. So it's length of the impacts, it's not the length of the project. So I think this could be utilized looking at those pictures, especially when you had the reference site with the 2009 oil pad and the 76 one, you know, because this will determine, I think it can help us determine how long a proponent or applicant would need to be required to do mitigation.
Yeah, I think that could be definitely an application. We actually, and we didn't show the data, but we did, Miguel and his group did record when they were looking at them in Google Earth, whether there had actually been any kind of reclamation activity. And we didn't detect very much of a signal in the art quantile from reclamation, which we thought was interesting. But it could be due to sort of reclamation is not reclamation is not reclamation, and so we just had a yes/no variable for reclamation. And then also we didn't have a really long time period, you know, given how long sometimes these things take to recover. But I do think that triggering mitigation like that would be a great application.
Yeah, and what Miguel and those guys did, you know, they're looking at it in Google Earth, and you can only tell so much. So, you know, there's times where they could tell that, you know, there's active mitigation measures that have been taken, but that doesn't mean that if they didn't see it, that doesn't mean there wasn't some done. I mean, that's seeing things in imagery is one thing. But if we could work more with field offices and have a record for each of these points as to which ones, like it had what type of mitigation measures done and how long it had been, then yeah, we could start really looking at trying to parse out what's working and what's not.
Right. I think in the past, you know, people have just, you know, thrown seed out onto the area where they're trying to reclaim, and they walk away from it, and that's their mitigation. But, you know, is that effective or not? And so, I mean, I think that's going to be a key thing with the new monitoring policies that are coming online. And then also, just a second note, I'm glad to see one of the things we're struggling with is how do we monitor our wildlife, and I'm speaking specifically sage grouse here, and I mean it could be for any other, but primarily sage grouse, how we monitor our restoration projects, I think is going to be a real key thing, and that's great that you guys are looking into that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. Anybody else on the phone? Would you like to ask a question? Again, just press *6 to unmute yourself. We still have no submitted questions, so we'll hang out here a little bit and see if something comes up. So Mike and Travis, while we're waiting, give somebody a little bit more time to type something in or formulate a question. Do you have any other final words you want to say, or anything that you forgot to say, or anything people should know about that you didn't cover?
Well, I'm really interested in, like, if other people, like, have come up with any other ideas, you know, of other things that might be applicable for this process, and if, you know, would love to hear other ideas from folks, you know, because, you know, this kind of just emerged out of the need to figure out how to, like, get an idea of what's going on, but it seems like we kind of came to something that has a lot of applicability. So curious about other people's thoughts about application for this type of process.
Okay. Looks like we got a couple questions. Actually, this is a three-part question in the chat box, so I will read them to you. This is from Laura. Do I understand correctly that you are A, trying to fill in the blanks where Essurgo data are lacking in the Colorado Plateau for a soil texture layer for use in ArtDart? If yes, did you investigate the potential to automate the vintage 1970s hard copy soil surveys? And here's another part, but I can repeat this if you need it. And did you compare your soil texture variations with the available Essurgo data sets as a field accuracy check?
So yes, we filled in the gaps. I'm trying to remember everything that was said here. We didn't, so the old hard copy soil surveys were digitized into Surgo, and most of the observations that went into building Surgo are in NASIS, and so NASIS is basically the building blocks of Surgo. And so we were using the underlying building blocks of Surgo. So our validation was a withheld validation so we didn't directly compare to Surgo. I mean, I personally have worked on Surgo mapping projects on the plateau, and so, like, for me, like, the patterns made a lot of sense, the soil landscape patterns, from kind of that intuition of having, you know, gone out and, like, made a few hundred observations on the plateau. I don't know, what was the other question? And I'm pretty comfortable for the most part with the areas that were filled. I'd like to go in and do some more validation in some of those areas, and so we'll see how that works into the future. I think I might have covered everything there.
So Travis used the PED-on-point observations that are the underlying data behind the polygon map units that are in Surgo, and then Travis can tell me if I get this wrong, but the random forest machine learning has a built-in validation process where you're withholding some of the observations to get the out-of-bag error rate, and so the soil modeling effort has a built-in sort of validation based on comparable data, which is the point data.
And there is some point data that are in those unmapped areas. Obviously not as much as outside, because there's other projects that have been done within the guise of the Cooperative Soil Survey. You know, there's like StatsGo, which is the national soil map, and then special projects like the Rapid Carbon Assessment. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty solid process. But yeah, it's always, it can never hurt to go out and look more. So.
Thanks. Laura, too, if you want to jump on the phone, too, if you want need to clarify anything, or if they didn't totally answer your questions. Please feel free to press *6 and hop on the line. And, of course, we have an invitation to anybody out there to ask a question over the phone.
Okay, this is Laura. Sorry, thanks. My question, the last part was just that you guys did answer it. It seems that the soil texture wouldn't be the only property that would allow for the analysis, so I was just wondering if you were investigating other parts of soil classifications that might be useful for looking at how these impacts might impact the landscape.
Yeah, it's yeah, I'm trying to, we're looking at all the different levels of soil taxonomy where we have a lot of data. I mean, there's multiple data sources out there, point data sources, and I think that making soil subgroup maps or soil grid group maps, which is also something that we're working on with ISRIC and Tom Hengel and there's other folks doing this too in the digital soil mapping community. I think those could also play a role and could be added within that process of art, and we just haven't tested that yet. And so those could be, iterations in the future that might even tighten it up more. So it's a good idea, and I'll probably be playing with it. I'm always playing with new mapping data, so.
Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. All right, we have a few more minutes. If anybody still has a pressing question they'd like to ask or type in. Even if you don't have a pressing question, we'll still take your question. Well, Mike and Travis, we have no more questions, it looks like. Oh, one just came in from Amanda. Is this ecological potential similar to land potential, such as Jeff Herrick's work?
Yeah, it's the same idea. Both Travis and I work a lot with Jeff. Land potential is the sort of a newer, more generic term that he's using for some of his new tools he's developing and for a lot of his international work. Land potential, I think they went with land instead of ecological, so people that are doing more sort of row crop agricultural stuff will think it applies to them and not just think it applies to ecologists. So it's the same, exactly the same concept.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, last call for questions, either by phone or the chat box. All right, there doesn't seem to be any more, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Just want to thank again Mike and Travis for presenting, taking the time out and putting this PowerPoint together and sharing it with you guys. And I'd also like to thank you guys, the audience, for attending today's webinar. For those of you who joined late, we'll be sending a recording of the webinar as well as the PDF of their slides, hopefully next week. So I'd just like to say goodbye to everyone and enjoy your day.
Okay. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Take care.